Welcome for some fresh sword content. Now, if you've been following my channel, you know that I've been through some recent hard fiscal times between the move and some other stuff that happened. Thank you all so much for your support again. But I figured maybe I deserved a little treat or two. So I went ahead and set aside some money and splurged on a couple of reasonably affordable swords that are also pretty new to the market. I haven't seen many people review these at all, so it's kind of taking a risk. But also, if you've been following the channel, you know that I really like, when it comes to European style swords, my one-handed, straight-bladed cut and thrust swords, and I do appreciate hand protection. Basket hilts are among some of my favorites to train with, and this is what Hanwei is calling their antiqued mortuary hilt. So let's go ahead and take a close look at it, compare it to some other Hanwei basket hilts, put it through the test, talk about how it handles, and spoiler alert, I really wasn't prepared for how well this one performed for me. Let's start as we usually do by talking about the Scabbard, and this has a lot in common with the other Hanwei basket hilt scabbards that I have, including the problems. So cosmetically, yeah, they all look very similar. You've got a blackened throat and shape, kind of look wrought iron, match the rest of the theme of the sword on these antiqued versions anyway. But this one's very plain. There's no hook or anything else, no other embellishment. Has that same sort of distressed hand leather, pretty thick. It's been pretty durable on the other scabbards. Has a decorative seam on one side. But here's your good and your bad. Your fit retention right now, well, passes the rattle test. There's no noise in there. Lockup, good, but it does release with a tug. That's not a problem. But I think you sort of heard the problem with these. That's not a wood core. As far as I can tell, it's an oval tube made out of some kind of fiberglass material. So I have to be really conscientious of how my edge is scraping against that. Yes, it can absolutely diminish my edge if I'm not careful. Now, reflecting, comparing to my other Hanweis, the Cromwell, which is an older sword, doesn't have good lockup because it's basically just the sword in a tube covered in leather. The back sword and this one have the benefit of about 3 inches of thick leather liner in there. It's where I'm getting my retention from. Basically, that is grabbing the base of the blade, and especially these languettes that extend out from the guard, these little ears. But when I first got it, I could barely get it in, and right now what you're going to see if you look close is there is still a couple of millimeters of clearance there. It's not all the way closed, locked up. And that's because basically retention is being created by the steel wedging itself into that thick leather. Over time, though, it's breaking in. The problem is that also means that over time, it's probably going to break in too much and get loose, and then I'm going to be dealing with another problem. So I'm going to say overall, I am really not a fan of these scabbards. Close-up mode to take a look at the friendly end, and yes, I'll have to put up lots of pictures because there's tons of detail carved into the guard and the pommel. Now the texture, I think they went with something that looks hand-carved that has then been kind of worn down with age. I don't think it's muddy. I think this was intentional. And I think it looks pretty attractive. Now, unlike a true mortuary hilt sword, it does not have a King Charles face on it, but I think that's fine. I don't need anybody's face on my sword. I think appearance-wise, it's pretty well done. And I may wear off some of this blackening to make that engraving pop more. I just haven't done it yet. Now, as for construction, like my other Hanweis, it is a threaded construction. I have not tried to take it apart. Haven't felt the need to. I didn't need to remove any unwanted liners or tassels or anything like that. The guard itself, the basket, is attached to the pommel with 3 screws, which is pretty traditional. What was really surprising to me, though, was what was inside the grip. My other Hanwei basket hilts came with ray skin grips that had wire twisted around them and, yeah, kind of that spiral profile to them, whereas this one comes with a very plain oval. It's a wood core covered in leather, glued down seam on the front, which I can feel a little bit, but it's not peeling up. What I can really do, though, because it's that same tan as the Scabbard, is I could definitely see it, especially as it collects dirt, so I am very tempted to dye it a darker color. Just haven't done it yet. But it's got a palm swell profile that I really like. You've got copper braided Turk's heads, top and bottom, that are visibly tacked in, but I'm not feeling any snags, any hot spots, any pokey wire bits, so that's good. Also at the top of that grip you have that traditional sort of English anvil shape, but it's not, again, pronounced enough that I'm running into it with my fingers. I'm not feeling it. So no hot spots on the grip. It's actually a very comfortable sword to wield bare-handed. And it also includes the bottom bars. They're not really colliding with the bottom of my hand. Speaking of which, okay, functional dimension. The grip itself, 4 inches 10 centimeters. For my medium width hand, it's pretty generous in here and allows my hand to shift around, get a reasonable amount of mobility out of this otherwise restrictive guard. We'll talk about that in handling. But because it is the smoothest grip, we do have to do the twist test. So I'm going to white knuckle that leather, grab a hold of the scabbard and crank. And I'm actually pretty surprised by how well it stays put. So let's talk about the business end. Before we proceed, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the real sword that this is based on and the semi-mystery inscription on the fuller. I'll put up a close-up picture, but let me see if I can show it to you. On both sides it says XX1414XX. That is thought to be a maker's mark, but apparently nobody's sure whose maker's mark. Now, this is based on a 17th century dragoon sword from the English Civil War that is in the Royal Armouries collection. And I've heard at least one reviewer call it the best reproduction basket hilt on the market today. So is it? Alright, this is where things get interesting, starting with the global stats. How much did I pay for the thing? Well, it's in the same price range as my other Hanwei basket hilts, about $400 US, and I found my best deal at Sword Buyer's Guide. I'll put the link down in the description, which is about twice the price of what you would pay for Cold Steel's attempts. Now this is another 1566 blade, which is a high carbon steel with some manganese added. It's one of Hanwei's favorite steels to work with. Test files say running about 52 HRC, which is great for a through-hardened mono steel blade. But, okay, speaking of things getting interesting, compared to my other Hanweis, this sword weighs a surprisingly light 2 pounds 4 ounces, 1,020 grams. That's pretty much a full pound lighter than the Cromwell and 3/4 pound lighter than the back sword I have from them, despite some of the other dimensions being fairly similar. Okay, so you've got a 33-inch blade length, 84 centimeters. Yes, I'm looking at my notes to give you the metric as well as the imperial. Width at the base, 1.25 inches, about 3.25 centimeters, which is just barely slimmer than the backsword in the Cromwell. But this is a lenticular cross-section. It does have short fullers on either side, so this would definitely be classified as more of a broadsword, but a very slim broadsword. Distal taper is pretty excellent, starting at, well, way down here, just above the languettes. Now, it is thinned out because that's where the fullers are, so that's about 5.5 millimeters, and then widens out just a little bit more towards 6 millimeters at the end of the fuller. But at the ogive of the tip, yeah, that's down to 2 millimeters. Let's take a look at distal flex. definitely more towards the foible, but we'll see how it flexes in the thrust testing. Now, giving it that antique finish, yes, my other two Basket Hilts have that antique treatment, which I'm not a huge fan of, but what they do is it's not pitted, it's kind of pebbled. It's almost like a really fine rayskin pattern that's been etched into the blade, and unfortunately when they etched into the blade, they etched it all the way to the edges, and then barely tried to sharpen it before they sent it to me. So two things I did to it. One, I did improve the edge on it, and we'll certainly take a look how the edges perform, and I did, like I did on my other antique Hanweis, sand off at least some of that knobbiness. All right, that all said, let's get to the testing. Hanwei. No damage. Post-test edge. Yeah. Summary of test results in one word: wow. Could this indeed be the best basket hilt on the reproduction market? Well, starting with my thrusting tests, first into my pel, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper up against my redwood target, and then to test into harder media straight into the redwood. What am I looking for? Into the softer media, penetration and channel, and this thing penetrated deeply with not a whole lot of effort. It's definitely more on the needle end of the spectrum of my tip geometries between shovel and needle. Then straight into the redwood, I'm testing durability, especially that really keen needle-like tip, and it didn't take any damage. The next thing I'm testing is flex, so I'm thrusting with the blade basically horizontal to the camera, in second or cot, so you can see it flex. And what you saw was it spring but not bend, even into the harder media, even throwing my hand over the tip, which usually gets a blade to flex on me. And again, for a blade this slim, I expected more flex. It is surprisingly stiff for what it is. Third thing I'm testing, how does it translate that linear impact back into my hand? Does my hand stay put? Any uncomfortable collisions? And yes, especially into the harder media, this grip got a bit slippy, but it was just the top of my hand then colliding with the flat shell, so it wasn't uncomfortable. The next test, bamboo test, can I induce a chip or a roll in this really keen edge? And the answer is no. Now, I'm not trying to chop through that media. I'm hitting it with about the pressure and rhythm I would use when I'm fencing. And doing that, well, first it bit impressively into that hard media, but also it gives me a sense of how nimble this sword would be in moving around with also an opponent's weapon present. And yeah, this sword was really quick and responsive, especially for a one-handed blade. Finally, cutting. Now I'm using cardboard panels that I've calculated with experimentation to be about the same resistance as a medium-sized water bottle. Also, the vise that they're in is just sitting loose on the table, so a bad cut will knock the whole thing off the table, just like a water bottle. And I'm going to say, yeah, this sword, again, for one that is, doesn't have a lot of blade mass, blade presence, cut exceptionally well, phenomenally well. Sailed through those panels like they weren't even there. All right, how does it handle martially? Before we get to martial handling, let me go ahead and recap my criteria for evaluating a sword. First up, the stats. Does it fit me? Does it feel good in hand? Does it move for me? And the answer to all of that is yes, absolutely. My biggest issue is I feel like I'm cheating because it's so light. I'm not necessarily getting the PT, the exercise I would be getting out of wielding training with a heavier blade. But it gives me more speed, which makes me look good. Second criteria, what some people really mean when they ask if a sword is battle ready. Part one is, will it cut? And the answer is yes, absolutely, but it is a light, slender blade. I've only really tried it on relatively light targets. I don't think it would make a good heavy target cleaver, but it might. I may try it one day. And second part of battle ready is durability. Can I hit stuff with it? And so far, these 1566 Hanwei swords have proven themselves to be impressively durable. The ones I've had longer have taken a lot of abuse and held up to it just fine. So far, this one is following suit. So now we get to my martial criteria, and I'm going to make a few comparisons as well. My three main criteria for evaluating a sword as a martial tool include, well, for a weapon of this length, its defensive and offensive capability and its responsiveness against a reactive, unpredictable opponent, and also the variety of application depending on how that opponent may be armed and what techniques they might be using. Cross-training. And this has a lot of capacity with, yes, a few potential limitations, also a few surprises though, starting with the defensive. Do I feel confident defending, protecting myself against a variety of incoming attacks? And it is a bit mixed. Okay, plenty of hand protection, that's not the issue, but it is a light blade. It doesn't have a lot of mass, a lot of authority, but I have learned to use good fort mechanics to parry a heavier weapon with a lighter weapon, which would include something like a small sword. And I would say in doing that, this has a much better grip, or I have a much better grip on it than I would with a small sword. But offensive capability. Well, you've seen how it can cut, but because it doesn't have a lot of authority, it's not a cleaver. It wouldn't feel like I could chop through a target or maybe even get through thick clothing. But because it is quick, it makes for a great tip slash or snap cut or something like that, or draw cut slash. Yeah, I could be pretty effective with it, assuming there's not a lot between me and what I'm trying to get to. And we need to talk a little bit about the back edge as well. Now, if I'm using a back sword, I am very used to using, as I would on a saber as well, only about 4 or 5 inches of sharp on the false, and that's plenty. But considering, well, this guard is obviously directionally dedicated to having a true edge and a false edge, yet both edges are sharpened, well, equally sharp and equally far down. Now, there's one thing that takes away from me, which we'll get to when we make the comparisons here in a moment. But what it potentially gives me are things it gives me with other double-edged weapons, for instance, a gen where I might be able to use the back cutting, back slashing action closer into myself at closer range. So possibilities there with some built-in limitations. One thing it does very well though is thrust. That is an awesome penetrator, almost equal to something like a rapier. So yeah, quick, nimble, accurate. I can get it on target, move it around in some very small, subtle shapes. And speaking of which, in cross-training, all right, some of you guys are going to immediately start typing in the comments. I have been making use of a rapier and small sword technique with weapons like this, and especially this one does it pretty well. But Mike, you can't possibly do that with a basket hilt. It's too restrictive. You can't get the sword in line with your arm. I must just be built weird because, yeah, I pretty much can. It's not quite as clean as it would be on a small sword or a rapier, but it's good enough that I can make a lot of those techniques work for me. And in certain ways, I really like how those bars sort of support my wrist. So it feels pretty secure in the hand, especially as compared to, I'm not a fan of the delicate grips on a lot of small swords. I just don't feel like I have a good grip on the weapon. I feel like I have a great grip on this one. But now it's time to make comparisons to a heavier basket hilt. To make the comparison, I'm going to go big. Not cold steel big, but the biggest, heaviest Hanwei I've got. And the one I've had the longest, the Cromwell. We already talked about the difference in specs. And I have made some changes to this sword over the years. I improved the inside of the shell and the grip for my comfort. I've done a lot of work on this blade, took off a lot of that knobby antiquing, so it's a smoother blade with more of an apple-seated cutting edge, has a functional back edge on it now, and some of my viewers pointed out it had some, well, pretty disappointing distal taper. It's much better now, so you may see an update video on this sword. But I've got it to the point where it does respond for me and remains one of my favorites to use as a training tool. But having the extra blade mass and authority, well, it feels more confident for parrying, displacing, especially a more sizable weapon. But it also comes up if I'm pairing this with something in my offhand. Now, with the Mortuary being very light, if I put something light in my other hand, like a dagger, or maybe a cloak, it does feel really good. And like I said, I can cross-train and use toolboxes from other sword systems with it. But the heavier and bigger the thing in my other hand is, if it goes up to something like a hatchet or a hawk, and yes, I will get to the hatchet and hawk content soon, I promise, or a sizable shield. I don't have a targe, this will have to do. It begins to feel kind of unbalanced and insubstantial. I can certainly make it work, that's not the problem. But it feels more appropriate to make that pairing with something, well, more substantial. So that's what I'm going to probably go with. The other thing a back sword does for me really well, though, is half swording, because I have that blunt spine for 2/3 to 3/4 of it. Now, when it comes to half swording, the system I'm most familiar with, I've spent the most time with, is Japanese style. So I'm going to be grabbing that spine and pinching it in a couple of different hand orientations. I use that fully to get a really good grip on it to be able to use this blade at close quarters. And that is awesome. Gives me options. Now, I have certainly seen people demonstrate that you can half sword a double-edged weapon, but this one is so keen and so sharp and so toothy, I really would not feel comfortable trying that, especially if this thing is going to move or take a hit or something without a really heavy glove on. So that's a potential limitation. So let's get down to the bottom line. Is this the best basket hilt on the current reproduction market? And I'm going to say it's really good. I'm really impressed with it, but it depends on what you're looking for. Are you looking for one that is lighter? I mean, this is a great example of, shall we say, a somewhat later period sword where they were going for something that was quicker, nimbler, more carry-friendly than a beefier beast. So if you're looking for something like that, this is absolutely an awesome choice. If you're looking with something with more meat in it, I would absolutely recommend, well, either of the other Hanweis that I have, the Cromwell or their back sword. But let's go ahead and cut this off here. We'll get our conversation started. If you have any questions about this sword, have other basket hilts, want to give me some recommendations for other single-handed cut and thrust swords, I do have a number of other swords coming in, and some I haven't gotten to yet. They're still sitting on the back burner, but I am planning to balance my reviews between knives and swords, and yes, get to the hatchet and hawk content. But until next time, thank you as always for watching, liking the videos, subscribing to the channel, adding to our conversation, following my journey, putting up with my madness, and I hope to see you back for our next episode, the sword I got shortly after this one, the Kingston Arms Scottish single-handed sword.